Hi. Every day you read another article in Newsweek, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, telling us that Russia is a threat to the West, that Putin is planning war, that he's massing troops on NATO's borders, that the Baltic states are in deadly danger, that Poland and Germany are next. In short, that Russia has to be destroyed in order to make the world safe for democracy. This is a kind of war hysteria which hasn't been seen in the West since the 1960s, and which strongly resembles a psychological preparation of Western populations for an aggressive war against Russia. Anyone who questions this war fever is treated as a traitor, a Putin bot, an agent of Russia, part of their hybrid warfare and propaganda campaign to subvert and destabilize the West. In short, if you don't favor war with Russia, you're an enemy of Western civilization, which is odd because, in fact, the greatest threat to Western civilization is precisely the Third World War, which our leaders appear to be determined to start. How did we get here? A good deal of this war hysteria has grown up out of the crisis in Ukraine. Now, almost no Western newspaper has provided the slightest historical analysis or explanation of what lies behind the crisis in Ukraine. That's why I thought it might be useful to give you some historical background, just so that you can know what it's really all about. Russia and Ukraine have been united on and off for more than 1,000 years. They were in fact originally one country. That state was founded by Swedish Vikings in the 9th century, after years of plundering the Slavic lands as they traded down the great river system between the Baltic and the Black Sea in order to trade with the Byzantine Empire, with its capital Constantinople. The Vikings decided that they would finally settle and rule those lands instead of simply plundering them. A Viking chief called Rurik built a fortress or Kremlin in a place called Novgorod, which is about 100 miles south of St. Petersburg, though St. Petersburg didn't exist then. If you go to Novgorod today, you'll see a huge statue of Rurik the Viking, and below him statues of all the Tsars that are supposedly descended from him, all the way down to Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century. Rurik's son or nephew Oleg shifted the capital down to Kiev, which was much further down the river route to Constantinople. Greek monks came up from Byzantium to convert the ruling Kiev princes to Orthodox Christianity, and they brought them the Greek alphabet, which was called the Cyrillic alphabet after one of them, St. Cyril. In fact, Kiev soon became the largest and most magnificent city in the Christian world, and the Kiev princes ruled over a loose confederation of principalities which stretched through today's Belarus, through most of Ukraine and western Russia as far as Moscow to the east and Novgorod to the north. This loose federation, which was called Kievan Rus, prospered for 350 years, despite it weathered all sorts of wars and of a regional and dynastic kind, because these various Viking settlements were forever fighting each other. But until in the middle of the 13th century, a real disaster struck. Genghis Khan's Mongols swept through Asia and parts of Europe and destroyed Kiev. Kievan Rus, the first Russian state, was broken up, and it came under the dominance of the Mongols. As their rule receded, Lithuania and Poland moved into the vacuum left behind and divided up what is today Ukraine, western and central Ukraine, between the two of them. The rest of Ukraine was a kind of no man's land where many Ukrainian peasants fled from Polish rule because it meant serfdom, and the Poles tried to convert them to Catholicism. They set up armed villages in eastern Ukraine and central Ukraine, and they called themselves Cossacks. Now, as the Poles kept encroaching on their territory, These Cossacks gradually began looking eastwards for help from a new rising Russian power, a new rising Russian state, which was also governed by descendants of the Rurik dynasty and was centered on Moscow. These people were Orthodox like themselves and therefore potential allies against the Poles. So this new Russian state, which was basically trying to expand its territory in all directions, defeated the Poles, pushed them out of central Ukraine into the western provinces, which Poland held on to until the Second World War. And gradually this alliance with Ukraine, which was sealed by a certain number of treaties, the main one being in 1667, became a union, and Ukraine in fact passed under the control of Russia, or if you want, the Russian Empire. Now this involved increasing domination by Russia, which was resisted by one Cossack leader 40 years later, who attempted to ally with Sweden in order to gain his independence again from Russia, but Peter the Great defeated the Swedes, and the Cossacks were gradually brought under total Russian control and lost all their autonomy. Of course, this sort of thing was in fact happening all over Europe, as the gradual consolidation of large nation-states involved the conquest and assimilation of weaker neighbours. If you look at the English domination of its conquered vassal states, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and the ruthless imposition of English upon them, or if you look at the French annexation and assimilation of the surrounding countries, Brittany, the Basque Country, Languedoc, Provence, Savoy, Corsica, Alsace-Lorraine, you can see that most great European nation-states were created by conquest and the imposition of their language on neighbouring peoples. Ukraine did not escape this rule. How complete that assimilation is determines how long separatist independent movements remain alive. We can see that the three vassal states of England have either sought or are seeking independence, as are some of those of Spain, Catalonia and the Basque Country. The French, on the other hand, have managed to crush the sense of separate identity so completely that no significant independent movements remain there, with the possible exception of Corsica. And the regions that they suppressed so ruthlessly before have hardly any memory that they were ever separate regions or that they were ever oppressed. Ukraine in its relations with Russia resembles Wales in its relations with England or Catalonia in its relations with Spain, rather than the regions of France, because linguistic assimilation was not complete, as it was in most of France. A peasant poet called Shevchenko in the 15th century, who was sent to study in St. Petersburg, began writing poems in his own language, a rural dialect until then, and this Ukrainian language was then established as a literary language which began to be used by a certain number of other writers in Ukraine. Ukraine from then on became a bilingual country where both Russian and Ukrainian were spoken. The existence of a flourishing native language becomes, of course, a rallying cry against what is seen as colonial domination. But that has not prevented many Welsh writers, for example, expressing themselves in English, or many Ukrainian writers, such as Gogol or Anna Akhmatova, writing in Russian, nor did it stop the Welshman Lloyd George from becoming Prime Minister of Great Britain, or the Ukrainian Brezhnev from becoming dictator of the USSR. The fact that Ukraine was part of a Russian-speaking empire for over 300 years made Russian the language of the educated of the country in exactly the same way as English became the language of the educated people of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, over roughly the same period. Yet, as I've said, the native language survived in Ukraine as it did also in Wales, though not in Scotland. There were periods when Ukrainian was encouraged, notably under the Bolsheviks, the early Bolsheviks, who thought it would help to make them liked by the Ukrainians. And there were periods when it was suppressed, as it was under Stalin, who thought that it was encouraging nationalism and was becoming something that was encouraging a separatist movement of some sort. After the revolution in 1917, there was a brief attempt to set up an independent Ukrainian republic in Kiev, but it was crushed by the rival Soviet republic based in Kharkov. During Stalin's forced industrialization and collectivization of agriculture, a huge famine occurred in Ukraine in 1932-33, killing several million people, as it did also in other parts of the USSR for the same reasons. The deliberate steps taken to worsen the famine and the shooting of those who tried to flee from it led to accusations of genocide, as the great famines in Ireland and British India in the 19th century have done as well. A political motivation in the desire to crush Ukrainian nationalism may have been a factor, but there is little evidence of any ethnic Russian racism against Ukrainians, comparable to the English racism towards the Irish and the Indians. The determination to call these famines genocide is generally motivated by nationalist hatred of the colonizing nation. Today, the crimes of the USSR are chiefly evoked to stir up hatred not of totalitarian communism, which was their true cause, but hatred of Russia. As we see this rewriting of history in nationalist terms, it is salutary to remember that the USSR was ruled for far longer by non-Russians than by Russians, by non-Russian dictators, notably the Georgian Stalin and the Ukrainian Brezhnev, who together ruled the USSR for two-thirds of its existence. We mentioned the fact that a nationalist government was set up in Kiev after the 1917 revolution, while a Soviet government was set up in Kharkov in the Russian-speaking east of the country. Western Ukraine has always been the Ukrainian nationalist stronghold. And in 1917, Kiev had large Polish and Jewish populations. This is because all of the western part, including Kiev, was under Polish rule until the mid-17th century, and the two westernmost provinces of Galicia and Volhynia remained part of Poland until 1945, with the exception of a period of 130 years when they passed under the Austrian Empire because Poland was partitioned among its neighbors. These two provinces thus never spoke Russian and never came under Russian rule until 1945. These two provinces, the Ukrainian nationalist movement which grew up in those regions, especially after the restoration of Polish rule over them in 1918, was aimed against the Poles who were trying to assimilate the Ukrainian population. It was this nationalist movement which reached a high point in the 1930s, where one wing of it was headed by a man called Stepan Bandera, who was an ultra-nationalist, who began a policy of terrorist assassinations of Polish officials. When these provinces were occupied by the Soviet Union in 1939 as part of the division of Poland between Hitler and Stalin, the Soviets cracked down on the Ukrainian nationalists. But in 1941, when the Nazis invaded, they saw the Ukrainian nationalists as potential allies. The relations between Bandera and the Nazis were complex, because when his movement declared independence, Bandera was arrested and imprisoned. But many of Bandera's men were Nazi sympathizers, benefiting from Nazi complicity, and they embarked on a policy of genocide of the Polish population in rural Galicia and Volhynia. Their militias attacked Polish villages and massacred men, women, and children, often with extreme cruelty, in order to rid these two provinces of their Polish inhabitants and prepare them for union with Ukraine after the war. They're thought to have butchered 100,000 Poles and driven out many more. The Nazis did nothing to stop them, and many of the Ukrainian nationalists joined the SS Galicia division to fight the Red Army, which had most support in the Russian-speaking east of Ukraine. Thus, the conflict between East and West Ukraine today has its roots in a World War II conflict between supporters of the Nazis in the West and supporters of the Red Army in the East. When the Donetsk rebels labeled the Kiev post-Maidan government Nazis because of their glorification of Stepan Bandera and his racist mass murderers, you must bear in mind this historical background. The Maidan Revolution was spearheaded by nationalist militants from the western provinces, notably Kiev, who saw Bandera as their hero. These neo-Nazi militias, their neo-Nazi militias like the Azov Battalion in the right sector, played a leading role in the war waged against the Donbass separatists. Whatever your opinion of the Ukrainian government, the accusation of Nazism against their most militant supporters was not without basis, as the imitation swastika flags of the Azov Battalion make clear. Well, going back to the Second World War, to the dismay of the Ukrainian nationalists, the Nazis lost the war. The two western provinces were transferred from Poland to Ukraine as they had hoped, but it was a Soviet Ukraine, not a nationalist one, and the Nazi collaborators had to flee before the Red Army. Many of them fled to the USA and Canada, which explains the violent anti-Russian bias of much of the Ukrainian diaspora in North America. Others stayed behind and waged a large-ditch guerrilla war against the Soviet government with the support of the British and American intelligence services. They made little headway against the totalitarian state, and the Ukraine was integrated into the USSR's centralized economy as a major heavy manufacturing country. Such was the gratitude felt towards Ukraine by the Russians for its war efforts. The biggest battles in the Second World War, the biggest battles in history, took place on Ukrainian soil, and it lost nearly a quarter of its people. That Nikita Khrushchev, who had spent his youth in Ukraine's Donbass region, decided to transfer Crimea to Ukraine as a gift in 1954, without, of course, consulting the Crimean people. This gesture of gratitude was to have fateful consequences. Crimea had been conquered long after the rest of Ukraine had been united with Russia. Until the late 18th century, Crimea remained in the hands of the Mongols, or Tatars, who had swept through the Eurasian continent in the 13th century, as we saw. Though they were gradually pushed out of other areas, this Muslim Tatar people remained in what was called the Khanate of Crimea, which became a vassal state of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. They carried on a vigorous slave trade by kidnapping Ukrainian and Russian peasants and selling them as slaves to the Turks. 2 million Slavic slaves are estimated to have been trafficked in this way to the Turkish Empire. Finally, Catherine the Great put an end to this abominable trade by invading Crimea in 1783. She annexed it, and it remained part of Russia till Khrushchev's foolish gesture in 1954. The Tatars were encouraged to migrate to Turkey and were replaced by Russian settlers. Their descendants mostly speak Russian today. As we said, Crimeans were not consulted when their country was transferred to Ukraine, but this was thought to be merely an administrative matter with no real significance because Ukraine and Russia were seen as inseparable. Khrushchev could not foresee in his wildest nightmares the breakup of the USSR. But, of course, it did break up, and Crimea was made to go with Ukraine. The Crimean Parliament protested and held a vote in 1992 for independence instead. They tried to hold a referendum to officialize their independence, but the Kiev government refused to allow them. So, in a sense, Crimea was held in Ukraine against its will. Now, the Russian government of Yeltsin took little interest in them. It was only interested in obtaining a lease of the port of Sevastopol, home of the Black Sea Fleet, as part of the division of the Navy, which had to be negotiated with an independent Ukraine. Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons that were stationed on its soil, and its borders were guaranteed by Russia and various other countries. Provided Ukraine and Russia remained allies and close friends, the fact that Russia's greatest naval base was now only leased to them didn't seem to be an insuperable problem, compared with the economic and financial collapse that Russia was soon facing with a change of its economic system. The neocons in America viewed these events rather like sharks circling a shipwreck. They saw themselves as having won the Cold War, and saw Russia as a defeated enemy to be occupied one way or another. When Russia withdrew from its empire, set free the countries of Eastern Europe, allowed the reunification of its old enemy Germany, and disbanded the Warsaw Pact, the USA promised Gorbachev they would not take advantage of this to advance the NATO alliance into the territories of the USSR had just given up. The Americans broke this promise like a twist of rotten thread. Throughout the 90s, NATO advanced to the very borders of Russia under the pretext of requests for protection by the fanatically anti-Russian revanchist regimes of Poland and the Baltic states. The American neocons' goal was to destroy Russia as a great power, to force it into a state of bankruptcy where it would no longer be able to maintain its formidable nuclear arsenal, and reduce it to a vassal state, disarmed and with a puppet regime. Until America achieved these goals, Russia would be treated as an enemy. The neocon plan for the world was that no country should ever again have the military means to resist the will of the United States. Instead of the bipolar, balanced world of the Cold War, there would be a unipolar world with American hegemony over the whole planet. This was to be the new Roman Empire all over again, where civilization was to be synonymous with the total domination of the earth by one power. The neocons at once saw that Ukraine was Russia's Achilles heel. It was a country divided between a Russian-speaking population that was generally friendly to Russia and a Ukrainian-speaking population which looked back to the nationalist movements that had struggled against Russian domination. These nationalists interpreted the whole historic relationship not as one of kindred peoples, but as one of colonial oppression. The same sort of division exists also in the sentiments of Scotsmen and Irishmen towards the English. Half of them see England as a friend, kindred nation, and half of them see England as an oppressive colonial power. But in the case of Ukraine, the neocons saw that if only the nationalist camp hostile to Russia could be made to gain the upper hand, then they could get hold of the famous base of Sevastopol, the great naval base, home of the Black Sea Fleet, by the simple device of persuading the Ukrainian government to cancel the lease to Russia and lease it instead to the US Navy. The Black Sea would thus become an American lake, patrolled by the Sixth Fleet, with its nuclear missiles a few miles off the shores of Russia. Russia, hemmed in on all sides, would cease to be a great power at one stroke, and Putin, the leader who had pledged to restore its status as a great power, would fall in utter disgrace, and his successors would beg for the humble position of dog under the American table. To this end, America began blatantly interfering in Ukraine's political process. The habitual alternation of governments in Ukraine between those supported by the Russian-speaking East and those voted in by the Ukrainian-speaking West were given a new ideological and geopolitical twist. The governments supported by the Western provinces were seen as pro-European and open to the modern world. Those supported by the populations of the East were seen as pro-Russian, backward-looking. It was democracy and progress against an old backward system of Russian-influenced corruption, gangsterism, and patronage. As the neighboring countries of Poland and the Baltic states had money poured into them by the European Union in order to anchor them to the West and bribe them to join NATO, the West Ukrainians began agitating to follow the same path. A first intervention by European NGOs and US agents led to the cancellation of an election which an Eastern president won, and its rerun under a barrage of propaganda to elect a Western president. This was called the Orange Revolution. However, to the dismay of the EU and US lobbies, if you can call them that, the Western government proved as inept and corrupt as its predecessor. And after 5 years, the same Eastern president, Yanukovych, whose election had been overturned, was re-elected. Despite being a Russian speaker, he began negotiations with the EU for a trade association as a first step towards possible membership. The EU proposal was extremely mean, however, offering very little access to EU markets for Ukrainian goods and offering piddling levels of funding. Yanukovych, as a negotiating tactic, suspended talks and went back to get another offer from the Russians, who were setting up their own free trade area and keen for Ukraine to join. Putin offered them 15 billion euros, 20 times more money than the EU had. As Yanukovych hesitated, the West Ukrainian political parties saw him as turning his back on Europe and democracy, and sent their people into the streets to protest. The ongoing demonstrations soon became a permanent insurrectionary camp in the main square of Kiev Maidan. The Americans openly encouraged the Maidan protests. Their politicians, such as Victoria Nuland of the State Department, walked among the protesters, promising US support if they overthrew the government. On the 18th of February, clashes between demonstrators and police became violent as the crowd attacked government buildings. What the hell have we got here? We seem to have right. We're in the middle of the revolution of Maidan there. Shots were fired. Dozens of people were killed, including some policemen, and things looked as if they'd got beyond the point of no return. But on the 21st of February, Yanukovych negotiated with the opposition, and this led to a compromise in which he agreed to certain constitutional changes and to early elections. But this peaceful resolution was rejected by the hardline protesters led by the neo-fascist right sector, and they immediately stormed the government buildings. Yanukovych, not wishing to call in the army, left for a party convention in Kharkov, his fief. In his absence, and that of all of his supporters, the parliament voted to impeach him and issued a warrant for his arrest. He fled to Russia. In the Russian-speaking east of the country, militants staged their own demonstrations against what they saw as a coup d'etat by the parties of the western provinces. In some cities, they tried to seize power from the local authorities and declare independence from the new government. Lviv in the west had just done the same thing against the Yanukovych government a few days before. In the two cities in the Donbass region, Donetsk and Lugansk, the militants succeeded in taking control. Instead of seeing this as a political protest to be resolved politically, the new government in Kiev saw it as a rebellion by pro-Russian terrorists and sent in their army and air force. The fiction that this was a Russian invasion was broadcast to the world, and the Western media, eager to see Putin as an aggressor, took up the fiction. Of course, once bombs and shells began falling on Donetsk and Lugansk, the Russians did begin to intervene to stop the massacre of civilians and arm the newly formed citizens' militias. Putin simply could not afford to see a massacre on his borders of Russian speakers whose fathers and grandfathers were the heroes of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War, especially when the massacre was being carried out by the neo-fascist militias, the Right Sector and Azov Battalion, who were disciples of the Nazis of Stepan Bandera and carried his name above their imitation swastikas. Since, after all, the West had claimed the right to intervene militarily to save the rebels of Benghazi from a massacre by Gaddafi's troops, why wouldn't the Russians have the right to intervene to stop a massacre of Russian speakers by the Azov Battalion? Their intervention was in any case a very modest one, and nothing like the scale of the French Air Force's destruction of Gaddafi's army. At most, the Russians may have committed a few dozen tanks and a few thousand men. No planes, no offensive missiles. Their help has been just enough to prevent the rebels being crushed and overrun, but not enough to help them expand their territory. Russia has given far less military aid to the Donbass rebels, their own kith and kin, than America has given to the Syrian rebels, whom they don't know from Adam and whose country they have no business interfering in. But the biggest Russian intervention was in Crimea. There, the anti-coup demonstrations and seizures of control by local militants were quickly followed by the stealthy intervention of the sailors and troops of the naval base of Sevastopol, who were stationed there by treaty. In unmarked uniforms, these little green men took control of strategic points of the province and surrounded the bases of the Ukrainian army there. By negotiation, they persuaded the Ukrainian troops, their longtime colleagues and allies, to avoid bloodshed and withdraw from Crimea. Days later, a referendum was held on whether Crimea should rejoin Russia or not. There was overwhelming support for rejoining the mother country, and none of the foreign observers present doubted that the public celebrations of the huge crowds were genuine. Faced with a government in Kiev, which had already voiced its determination to ban Russian as an official language, The Russian-speaking majority in Crimea voted with their hearts for the continued existence of their culture and their language. Despite the hostility of the 15% of Tatars to Russian rule, the new Russian administration at once announced that there would be 3 official languages in Crimea: Russian, Ukrainian, and Tatar, in contrast to the linguistic totalitarianism in Ukraine. The Ukrainians at once imposed a blockade, as they did on the Donbass, cutting off all food and electricity supplies. Both regions are totally dependent on Russian supplies of food, medicine, and even banknotes for survival, and are living under a permanent siege. In the case of the Donbass, this includes permanent shelling and the killing of civilians in their homes. People talk of the reunification of Crimea with Russia as an illegal act. But so long as the world refuses to recognize and enforce the rights of peoples to secede, there is no other way but to secede illegally. Russia rightly points to Kosovo, illegally and forcefully separated from Serbia by NATO's bombing of Belgrade, as a precedent for their own actions. All the secessions of Yugoslav states were illegal because undertaken without the consent of Yugoslavia. Crimea had been transferred to Ukraine against its will by a communist dictator. Why shouldn't its people have the right to self-determination? Yet Ukraine and its NATO backers had denied them that right. But above all, the significance for Russia was a strategic one. In taking back Crimea, they also took back Sevastopol, their greatest naval base, home of the Black Sea Fleet for over 200 years, defended at the cost of 1 million Russian lives in 2 aggressive wars against Russia: the Crimean War, in which Tolstoy fought and about which he wrote his first major work, and then the Nazi siege in the 1940s, where the tragic fall of the city was followed by its glorious recapture by the Red Army a year later. The historic and sacred city and fortress was Russia's again, and forever. The neocons' devious plan to take Sevastopol for the US Navy and totally humiliate Russia and destroy it as a great power had failed. The major prize of the intervention in Ukraine had been snatched from them. They were beside themselves with fury. This rage perhaps explains the anti-Russian war hysteria they have whipped up to a level not seen since the dark days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. By portraying Russia as a land-grabbing aggressor, not a single major Western newspaper or magazine has even mentioned the vital interest Russia had in keeping Sevastopol from the American Navy. They've destroyed the relationship between Russia and Europe, which is America's other main goal, in order to keep the European vassal states subject to Washington. America's goal is above all to wean Europe away from dependence on Russian gas. This goal was also served by their intervention in Syria. America decided to overthrow Bashar al-Assad because of his refusal of a Qatari pipeline through Syrian territory to bring Qatar's natural gas to Europe and cut the Russians out of the European gas market. Assad's fidelity to his Russian ally led to America's massive armed support for the rebellion against Assad, even though the rebels were tainted from the start with an alliance with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Russia's efficient intervention to stop Assad's defeat had then to be portrayed as a monstrous campaign of mass murder in order to prevent the Western public from ever seeing anything positive in any Russian action. The aim of American foreign policy is above all a propaganda one, to vilify and isolate Russia, which explains their fury when their propaganda fails to convince. They're now trying to ban pro-Russian media from countering their narrative. All of this is clearly aimed at preparing the population for a nuclear war with Russia, which the Americans insanely believe that they can win because of their anti-missile systems, which have never been seriously tested, and which few people believe would really be able to knock down a couple of thousand Russian ballistic missiles. The greatest example of this twisted hate propaganda was when a civilian airliner, Malaysian flight MH17, was shot down over the Donbass war zone. It was the Kiev government that was morally and legally responsible for the tragedy for not closing its airspace. over a war zone where warplanes had been shot down by the rebels only a few days before. One may suspect Kiev and Washington of hoping for a tragedy of this kind to use as propaganda. Though there is no proof who did it, the probability is it was the rebels who brought down the plane, mistaking it for one of the US spy planes which are deliberately designed to look like airliners. One could say this was a case of Kiev using airline passengers as human shields for its bombing of its own people. The hysterical reaction of Western media and politicians, however, was not merely to blame the rebels for what was obviously a tragic mistake, but to accuse Vladimir Putin personally of deliberately shooting down a civilian airliner. What motive he had to do this, or how he could have given such an order to a missile crew who have less than 5 seconds to decide whether to shoot at something in the sky, was never explained. When video footage emerged on the internet of rebel fighters discovering the plane wreckage and repeating over and over in shock and horror, "Civilians," and then asking angrily, "Who let them fly this route?" This was played by Western media over captions that the rebels were engaging in a sickening desecration of the dead and gloating over their victims. This degree of hatred and calumny against a helpless people fighting desperately with whatever means they had against jet fighter bombers which were massacring their children in the streets can only be seen as the hate-filled propaganda that is used to prepare for war. If the Third World War does occur and human civilization is wiped out, it is to be hoped these videos will survive to teach the miserable remnants of humanity where the blame lies with the warmongering, hate-filled Western media and their Pentagon masters. It is still unclear how these crises in Ukraine and Syria will end and whether humanity will survive. The election of Donald Trump or the non-election of the warmonger Clinton gives at least some hope. The refusal of the West to accept any border changes except when they dictate them, as they did when they tore Yugoslavia apart in the greatest act of aggression since the Vietnam War. The refusal of the principle of self-determination for any people except allies of the West, condemning all others to live forever under the oppression of their enemies, will continue to lead to armed conflict all over the planet. Already it has led to the conflict in Georgia. The Soviet republics, by a stroke of Lenin's or Stalin's pen, shoved people together who were not of the same ethnic group, spoke different languages, and had often been age-old enemies. They tolerated this while they were part of a supranational federation, but with the breakup of the USSR, they had no wish whatever to stay together when they were now a single nation state, with the dominant people trying to impose its language and identity upon them. This was the case of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which had no wish to remain part of Georgia, their traditional enemy. They seceded, fought a war, and gained a de facto independence supported by Russian peacekeeping troops. It was Georgia's pro-Western president, egged on by his NATO backers, who invaded South Ossetia and was pushed out again by the Russians. But the Western politicians and media saw this as Putin's aggression and started the whole myth of Russia as an aggressive power. At every step of the way, Russia has merely been defending its own, and it is NATO which has been the aggressor. The total failure of mainstream Western journalists to do their job of impartial analysis has led us to the brink of war and the annihilation of mankind in our time. The inability of Western politicians and commentators to see the Russians' point of view may yet cost the human race its future. When any attempt is made to put the Russian point of view is now seen as treason or an insidious enemy propaganda, we are beyond the point of no return. If Russia proposed to Cuba to cancel the lease of Guantanamo naval base to America and lease it to the Russian Navy instead, what would America's reaction be, do you think? And yet Americans cannot see that this is what they were doing in the case of Sevastopol, which has far more importance in Russian history than Guantanamo ever had for America. The ignorance of the West's political and military leaders, their ignorance of history, of what certain historic places mean to rival countries, and where that country sees its vital interests and what it is willing to fight for, that will finally destroy the human race. It is tragic to think that mankind could have survived another 1,000 years if only West Point had had a decent history course.